กาได้ไปเกิดในกำเนิดมาโลกาขอให้ได้เสือเสียสุพันกัลลายากังตังกาเสโสอันนี้เป็นสีที่ตาบอนละจงก็กาเลบุตะเมลาเกตาวาลังยาจายุกาสมนะสาลีบทเอติตังปันติลาสุ
This is a story about Laos, first and foremost, but it's also a story about an imperfect bike, out to prove to the world that you don't need an expensive super bike to have a perfect ride. It's also a story about a man out to prove to himself that you don't have to be in perfect shape to enjoy a fantastic adventure on your imperfect bike. It's easy to get caught up in trying to get everything just right in order to guarantee success. And in a life where there are precious few guarantees that you can absolutely count on, most of the time you just have to go and do and figure it out along the way. And then sometimes, even with all the potential issues that can go wrong, everything just falls into place. Perfection. This is the story of that ride. Before I get into the ride, I want to talk a little bit about the country of Laos. It's a landlocked country surrounded by Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, and China. The topography is all mountains and river valleys. It's mostly rural with a few cities that in the rest of Asia would more accurately be considered small towns. The population, numbering only about 7.5 million, is divided into many different ethnic groups who speak dozens of languages and dialects. There are three main subgroups of the population, the lowland, upland, and highland peoples. The lowlands are dominated by the Lao people, who are the largest ethnic group in the country and dominate nearly every aspect of life in the country. The Lao language is taught to everyone in school, and people generally use Lao to communicate between groups. The lowland groups are mostly Buddhist. The upland groups inhabit the mid-altitude lands, while the highland groups live in the higher mountains. These groups follow a mix of religious belief systems. Some are Buddhist, some are Christian, but most are animist. That's really an oversimplification of the ethnic makeup of Laos, because in reality you can find people from all of the subdivisions living mixed together. And each subdivision consists of many different ethnic groups speaking many different languages and dialects. Laos is a poor agricultural country that survives on a lot of foreign aid and a few important exports, such as electricity from the many hydroelectric power projects and the product of several large mining operations around the country. And of course, agricultural products play a key role in the economy. There are two seasons in Laos, the rainy season lasting from around May to October, and the dry season lasting from November to April. The dry season can be divided into a pleasant, cooler time from November to early February, and a hot, uncomfortably humid period that takes over until the rains begin. I started my ride in mid-February, just missing the cooler dry season, but luckily ending just as the real heat and humidity began. Why did I choose to ride a bike rather than rent a motorcycle or a car or ride buses along the way? Anyone who has ever ridden a bike extensively in any place knows how much more intimately you get to know an area just by slowing down, experiencing the sights and sounds and smells in a way you just can't experience in a car or any other quicker mode of transportation. Sure, you can get to a lot more destinations in the same amount of time by car or motorbike or bus, but you miss out on almost everything in between. Also, since my plan was to start in the south and end in the north, renting a car or bike seemed like it wouldn't work, and navigating bus routes in all of the rural areas I planned to visit would have been just a nightmare. So the bike just made sense to me, and I'm glad I went that route. Of everything I worried about in preparing for the trip, flying with the bike caused me the most stress. It turned out to be not too bad in the end, but I wasn't able to relax until the bike was out of the box and put together in Thailand. It's also not much fun dragging a big, heavy bike box around multiple airports and seeing the damage caused to the box along the way. Not by the luggage handlers, but by security cutting the box open at seemingly every airport I went through, pulling out the bike and the random parts that I had packed with it, and then attempting to repack everything and seal it with flimsy airport security tape. In the end, it worked out fine. They didn't lose or bend or break any parts, and I really didn't need to have worried so much about the bike, but it was stressful. I chose to bring a bike from home rather than rent or buy one on site so that I could set it up exactly how I wanted it ahead of time and have time to test it out before I ever left home. I'm glad I did it this way, though I did run into several cyclists who were able to find bikes in Laos or wherever they had cycled from. I also couldn't rent a bike because I wasn't going to be coming back to my starting point and couldn't return it easily. I ended up choosing a very basic bike with a very sophisticated name, a Windsor Wellington 2.0. I bought it for my son years ago and he never really rode it. I chose it over other bikes because it was cheap enough that if something happened to it along the way, I wouldn't be too upset. And it has a fairly rugged but lightweight aluminum frame with base level Shimano Sora components that I felt could withstand the rough roads and wouldn't need any special tools to fix along the way. I ended up switching out the Sora shifters for some cheap friction shifters because I had such a difficult time adjusting the Sora shifters that I didn't want to mess with them along the route. Friction shifters just work and need very little adjusting, and that turned out great. I also put on the widest tires I could get on the bike, which, it being a former road bike, were the still fairly skinny 32 millimeter Continental Ride Tour tires, and I put some slime-filled tubes in for extra puncture protection. That turned out to be a great combination, and I had zero issues with flats along the road. And the tires rolled super smooth on pavement and provided good traction on dirt, even on some steep hills with dirt sections. In all, I couldn't be happier with the bike setup. Sure, a high-priced touring bike would have been wonderful, but you really don't have to spend all that money to have a great ride, as long as you have the legs to get you through it. The route I mapped out ahead of the trip began in southern Laos. Actually, it began in the airport at Ubon Ratchathani, Thailand, and then worked north for about 900 miles and with around 60,000 feet of climbing over 15 days. I planned the route to avoid the busiest roads and stay on paved roads as much as possible, while also going through areas of Laos that I had never been to before. My travels in Laos have almost exclusively been along the Mekong River Valley, and most of that time around the city of Vientiane. My goal with this trip was to really immerse myself in the rest of the country, and that meant the route would have to go through the mountains. The road conditions ranged from very good to absolutely miserable. Broken pavement with fist-sized sharp rocks covered in inches of fine dust. Those sections that were broken up were just really difficult to get through. There were a couple of long dirt road sections that turned out to be some of my favorite parts of the ride. The worst parts were the hilly sections where the large trucks had broken up the pavement. Where I would have normally enjoyed the downhill sections after long climbs, I instead spent dodging and sometimes hitting large potholes, many of which were hidden in the shadows, waiting to destroy my wheels or cause a flat. In many places, formerly paved roads simply disappeared into 100 or 200 meter long miserable stretches. The weather was a big concern for me before the trip started, probably second of all my concerns after my worry about flying with the bike. My last ride before leaving Laos was through snow on a 15-degree Fahrenheit morning. From what I could tell ahead of time, it looked like I would be riding through mid to high 90-degree heat for most of the ride. That 75 to 80-degree jump in temperature is enough to make you second guess your sanity. And really, on the first day of the ride, I did that more than a few times. Fortunately, I was having so much fun that I could just ignore the weather and pedal and pedal and pedal. The sun definitely was an issue. I underestimated the sunscreen needs on the first day and ended up a nice crispy red color by the end of the day. With that lesson learned, I applied heavy sunscreen multiple times per day and was fine until my sunscreen from home ran out. I ended up buying some sunscreen along the way at a little shop in Salawan, but even though it was advertised as just plain sunscreen cream, it was something closer to a makeup foundation with 50 SPF sun protection. It turned my skin a little pink when I put it on, but since I was already somewhat red, I didn't really care much. I was able to ride just fine until the last 20 miles of the entire trip, when I dropped down out of the mountains above Luang Prabang and hit a wall of hot 98-degree humid air with a stiff wind in my face. It was a little much. What was supposed to be my last celebratory 20 miles into town, ready to finish the ride strong, that just turned into a grueling final test of my will to finish the ride. So what do you eat on a multi-day ride like this in a rural country far from home? I ate whatever I wanted and as much as I could handle. It was a risk I chose to accept based on many trips to Laos where stomach issues haven't been a problem, with a few minor but notable exceptions. I didn't eat much spicy food, which the Lao love and are famous for. That would not have been a risk that something might go wrong. That would have been a guarantee that I would have had issues on the road. So I avoided the peppers. Other than that, I grabbed whatever looked good at the moment or whatever I could find in some places. There are lots of small restaurants along the way, usually at least one in each village. Sometimes they're very well disguised, but you get to know the signs. One table in front of a shop or house may be just a place for people to sit and talk, but two or more tables likely means that's a place to eat. There are also little shops and stands everywhere you go, so picking up a snack or drink in pretty much any village along the road is just not an issue. Many of the little restaurants are simple noodle shops that keep a pot of broth hot and dry noodles ready to go. Most of those were pho and a dish called kopiak, which is another type of rice noodle that's a little thicker than the pho noodle. Those were the most common, and then you'd get a bowl of vegetables on the side to eat with your soup. There are also lots of stands with grilled meats and sticky rice for sale, lots of stands with boiled corn or some other local product for sale. Sometimes the meat is freshly grilled. Sometimes you could tell it had been sitting out for a while and they could then reheat it on demand. I wasn't really too picky with the grilled meats and didn't have any problems with it, but I did shy away from any stands with way too many flies or meat that had obviously been sitting out in the heat all day long. What was my favorite food on the route? That's really hard to say. For a hungry cyclist who desperately needed the energy, everything tasted fantastic. I had pho the most simply because it was the most readily available and it cost about $1.50 per bowl. The grilled meat and sticky rice was always great. It was good to just grab some and go, and I could stop and eat anywhere along the route. I had a great bowl of khao soi, another rice noodle dish in Luang Prabang. It's a specialty dish from the north that I haven't had in a long time, so I was really happy to find a well-made bowl of it there. Generally, food was cheap, easy to find, and tasted great. I met several fellow cyclists along the route, a few from Germany, a couple from France, one from Nepal, one from the UK. Alec, a young man on a gap year, traveling around, really on the verge of entering medical school. He'd been traveling by himself all over the world for about a year. It was nice to travel with him for about half a day after lunch one day and just talked about his experience riding around and getting ready to then go home and get into medical school. Nicolas, a 30-something-year-old Frenchman on a mission to find himself, according to his story. He started out backpacking, but the weight of the pack hurt his back, so he switched to cycling before getting to Southeast Asia. And he traveled all over Europe and Asia before getting on the bike. He rides this old bike with just way too much stuff. He actually carries a broken 20-pound accordion with him to entertain people and break the ice with anyone he interacts with. The problem is it is broken, and so it takes him a while to fix it every time he wants to play, but it does provide some entertainment and helps him to break the ice with the people and, I guess, find himself along the route. And then there's Julian from France, who was friends with Nicolas. They'd been friends for many months now after having met in, I think, Turkey in their travels. And then he'd actually been cycling for over a year and rode from France all the way through Europe and Asia and into Southeast Asia, and ultimately with the goal of getting back to Japan, where he had lived at one point for 6 months and worked there. He rides alone for the most part, but occasionally meets up with friends, and was planning to connect with Nicolas, who I had met the day before, so they could climb a big climb together and keep each other company during the painful experience. There are some great people that you meet along the road. These are just a few examples of the people I met along the way. Interesting people from all walks of life, all out for a little bit different reason, all riding their bikes, packed full of gear, and enjoying the scenery and people and food in Laos. My 2-week ride through Laos coincided with the cassava harvest. Cassava is a tuber from which tapioca and other foods are made. It's an important crop in tropical and subtropical regions of the world because it is high in carbohydrates and very drought resistant, making it an ideal crop to grow in the long dry season in Laos. Because the tuber decomposes quite rapidly after it's harvested, it must be quickly chopped up, dried, and sold off to be processed. The sweet variety can also be used similar to a potato in various dishes. People in Laos mainly use it as a dry season cash crop to supplement the wet season rice-based agriculture found throughout the countryside. I rode by many dams along the route, both existing and proposed. I'm not begrudging the country the chance to make money exporting electricity from the dams, and it's better than stripping the forests for lumber exports, and the big mines can really only produce for so long. But there are some big issues with the dams. I'm not going to comment much on the environmental impacts because that's not really my area of expertise, but I can relate what people told me as I passed through. When dams are built and areas flooded behind them, it has a major impact on the lives of those affected. One tuk-tuk driver in Luang Prabang told me about losing his land to the proposed Mekong River dam there. This is land that helped him survive the COVID lockdowns when tourism completely dried up. He planted about 1,000 banana trees that supported him and his relatives during the pandemic. He says he has about 500 left now that survived afterwards. But now he's been forced to accept a really minuscule payment to give up his land. It's land that supported multiple generations in the past and could have been passed down to support more in the future. The money he received is basically gone already, as it was not really enough to buy new land or invest in anything else. Another village had the river next to it completely diverted away, cutting off their supply of fresh fish and making water much more difficult to come by for other uses. The water is eventually dumped back into the river downstream, but it's sort of a sickly brown muck at that point. People can adapt and survive, but it's heartbreaking to see them forced to do it when they gain very little from the change, and they really stand to lose everything. My ability to speak Lao fluently often led to questions about why I could speak Lao in the first place. My quick answer is that my wife is from Laos originally, and that satisfies some people's curiosity, but most ended up wanting to learn more about me because of that. On my first day in Laos, one elderly woman asked a question I would hear again over and over for the next 2 weeks, though not quite as direct as she put it. She wanted to know how much I paid for my wife. Once I got over the initial shock at that question, I quickly explained that I hadn't actually paid for my wife. She had immigrated to the U.S. many years ago as a refugee after the war, where we eventually met in college. Another conversation shed some light on why this was a question on so many people's minds. Just before I reached Salawan, I sat down at a roadside noodle shop and spent some time talking with the two women who owned it. The conversation quickly turned to why I spoke Lao, and after hearing my explanation, they shared their thoughts on the young girls who are lured into slavery or prostitution by brokers who come into poor villages and offer around $2,000 to families of those young girls, always in their teens, with promises of marriage to wealthy foreigners, mostly Chinese. This is a twist on the traditional dowry system in Laos, where a young man will offer the family of his bride-to-be a sum of money or other goods to recognize the time, effort, and expense of raising a child. The brokers now play off of that, promising marriage to some unknown foreign man and then paying off the parents. The big difference is that in traditional society, the girl remains close to her family, and the young couple may even live with the girl's family to take care of her parents. The girls who are trafficked are usually never heard from again. Although the women did bring up one local example of a girl who ended up marrying a wealthy man from China who allows her to communicate with her family and even visit sometimes. From what I gather, that's really an exception and not the rule. Most are not so fortunate. I couldn't help but feel self-conscious riding through the countryside where people instantly thought of me as just another rich foreign man looking for a young Lao girl to purchase. Worse yet, I can't imagine the pain and suffering of the young women who get lured into that dark world. Laos has 3 UNESCO World Heritage Sites, one at Wat Pho, one in the Plain of Jars, and one at Luang Prabang. My route took me to all 3, 2 that I hadn't seen in 25 years, and 1 that I had never seen before. I'm really happy that the route worked out to make that possible. I'm not much into touristy travel, but if I'm going to do something touristy, these 3 at least offer some great cultural heritage educational opportunities. If you're in southern Laos, the Wat Pho World Heritage Site is certainly worth a visit. I visited the site once 25 years ago, and it hasn't changed much since then. There's a little more infrastructure to support tourism, but it doesn't have too much of a touristy feel to it. The site itself is an old Khmer temple complex ruin, similar to many of the sites in the Angkor Wat area of Cambodia. It doesn't have the diversity and grandeur of the Angkor Wat area, but it's a great place to stop by if you want a quick look at the old Khmer temple architectural style. Once you get past the ticket office and the cafe at the entrance, you can either walk or ride a small bus up to the site itself. At the site, you are free to wander in and amongst the ruins, where you can read several panels explaining the history of the site. The UNESCO World Heritage website describes Wat Pho as follows. The Wat Pho temple complex is a remarkably well-preserved, planned landscape more than 1,000 years old. It was shaped to express the Hindu vision of the relationship between nature and humanity, using an access from mountaintop to riverbank to lay out a geometric pattern of temples, shrines, and waterworks extending over some 10 kilometers. The whole represents a development ranging from the 5th to the 15th centuries, mainly associated with the Khmer Empire. So, if you are in southern Laos, again, it's a great place to go visit, one that I would definitely go back to again with a little more time to explore beyond the main central section. There are a number of areas outside of the main area that you can go and hike and explore that are certainly sites that I am looking forward to visiting again in the future. I had never been to the Plain of Jars World Heritage Site before this trip, and I'm really glad I finally found a way to get there. I've read a lot about the site over the years, both as an archaeological site and for the role it played in the war years from the 1950s to the 1970s. I had built up this grand idea in my head of what it would be like to visit in real life. Because of that, I have to admit I was a little disappointed at first, but I know that reality often has a hard time competing with what an active imagination has built up for over 30 years. As I settled in and wandered around the site that I visited, I was able to enjoy it a lot more, especially realizing that this was only one of many sites dotting the plain. The UNESCO World Heritage website describes the site as follows. The Plain of Jars, located on a plateau in central Laos, gets its name from more than 2,100 tubular-shaped megalithic stone jars used for funerary practices in the Iron Age. This serial property of 15 components contains large carved stone jars, stone discs, secondary burials, tombstones, quarries, and funerary objects dating from 500 BCE to 500 CE. The jars and associated elements are the most prominent evidence of the Iron Age civilization that made and used them until it disappeared around 500 CE. And also wanted to let you know that the small museum at the site that I visited is really worth taking some time to wander through. You can read a lot more about the site itself and get a better feel for the history of the area. The jars themselves, as I wandered through, are just sort of dotted around this little area, and you can walk and look in the jars and just kind of get a really good feel for what they look like. There's also an interesting cave in the area that was used during the war years as a shelter from the bombing that occurred during that time. This was an area that was highly contested during the war years, and control of the area went back and forth different times throughout the 30 or so years of warfare. This area was bombed heavily by U.S. planes supporting the Royal Lao government against the communist Lao movement that was supported by the Vietnamese who had been using this whole area on the eastern side of Laos to move up and down and avoid the U.S. troops in Vietnam. I did end up pretty disappointed with Luong Prabang once I finally arrived there. It felt like there were more tourists in the city than the local population. The last time I was in Luang Prabang 25 years ago, before it was named a World Heritage City, there was a better mix of foreign tourists and local population. This time I just didn't get that feel and couldn't wait to get out. Don't get me wrong, it's a great place to go see, but if you are expecting a pristine Lao heritage city, that's not what it is anymore. That said, there are a lot of great places to see around the city, and if you can ignore the more touristy side of things, there is a lot to learn about Lao history and culture there. The UNESCO World Heritage website describes Luang Prabang as follows. Luong Pang is an outstanding example of the fusion of traditional architecture and Lao urban structures with those built by the European colonial authorities in the 19th and 20th centuries. Its unique, remarkably well-preserved townscape illustrates a key stage in the blending of these two distinct cultural traditions. Now, I have to agree that's an accurate description, but of the three cultural heritage sites in Laos, I definitely prefer the other two over Luong Prabang. To be fair, that's my own personal bias speaking more than any impartial rating of the three sites. Luong Prabang is a living city with a population that needs to make a living, and there's just no way to preserve a place like that without the necessary changes that tourism brings. I also personally prefer quieter rural areas to cities, so definitely keep that in mind when listening to anything I have to say about Luong Prabang. In the end, I chose not to bring Wellington home. He rather enjoyed being the top dog bike while on the Lao trip, rather than being fifth or sixth out of the pack back at home. I determined to either sell or give him away to someone who would appreciate him. I figured that I wouldn't get much money for him, but selling might be better since people often take better care of things that they buy rather than stuff that they get for free. I quickly found that selling Wellington with less than a day to do it was not going to happen. So I went to a local bike rental place to see what they might do with him. They were skeptical at first because I didn't actually have the bike with me at the time. I had parked it down the street by one of the tourist sites there. But once they saw him, their eyes lit up, especially the 12-year-old son of the owner who happened to be quite tall for his age. He picked up Wellington and his eyes popped at the lightweight aluminum frame. Now, Wellington's not a particularly lightweight bike in comparison to my nicer bikes, but compared to the ones at the rental shop, he's something special. Anyway, the kid obviously wanted the bike, and his parents were more than pleased to see him happy about a bike. It turns out that he had been sideswiped by a car while riding his bike not too long ago and had been hesitant to ride since then. When they saw his excitement, it meant a lot to them. And the whole scene had a vibe like Christmas morning when the kid gets his new bike and he was so excited. Anyway, Wellington has a good home in a place where he'll be appreciated for the bike that he is and can be taken care of by the mechanics at the bike rental place. About an hour after I left, Wellington's new owners contacted me wanting to give me some nice wooden bowls as a thank you for giving them the bike and making their son so happy. It was just a really nice way to close out the ride. So I made it home. 15 degrees on my last ride before leaving for Laos. 90s all the way through, and then 98 on the last day. 3 days of travel, and I'm back home. It's 20 degrees, snowing. Quite a ride.
ไปเกิดในกำเนิดมาโลกาขอให้ได้เสือเสียสัวพันกัลลายากังต่างกาเสื